So there I was, fat, dumb, and happy, flying a B-25 with 10 people on board over the Grand Canyon. What could go wrong? Stick with us on FlyWire and find out. Yeah, I'm wearing glasses. FAA says I have to have them in my possession, but I have to have them on my face if I want to read. Hey, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire, we're going to cover an emergency resulting from an engine failure in flight at Las Vegas. Fortunately, this isn't an accident review, but I think there's some things that we can learn from it anyway. I promised I would talk about it in last week's video, you know, the accident review for the Cessna 310 crash in Las Vegas in late October 2020. This is my B-25 story. There just wasn't enough time to tell this story in the last video, so I'm going to tell it now. This story directly relates to exercising the pilot and command authority and the process of declaring an emergency, and then doing the paperwork if it's required at the end of all of that. Okay, so the B-25 Mitchell bomber I was flying was known at the time as the Pacific Prowler, and it made its living doing living history rides and pilot training. Mostly I focused on the training end of it, but I was fortunate enough supposedly, to fly this particular ride. We were flying out of McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, and on this particular July day, and it was hot, we took off with a full load of passengers to fly over the western part of the Grand Canyon, about, I don't know, 10 in the morning or something like that. It was beautiful, and you could see forever, and the bumps weren't too bad at this point. But before we got too far over the western end of the canyon, the right engine began running a little rough, with an intermittent misfire. I made the call to turn around and terminate the sightseeing flight. We headed back to the west and had to step down in altitude to conform to the Class Bravo serving Las Vegas. Over Lake Mead, the right engine would no longer run at anything above idle, so we pulled it back to idle. We ran the checklist in preparation for single engine operations, and I declared an emergency with the approach controller for Las Vegas. And the controller responded by telling me to step down in altitude to stay clear of the Class Bravo airspace. He didn't even acknowledge my emergency situation. But he did ask my intentions, and I responded that I intended to go to McCarran. He responded by telling me that no, divert to Boulder City. I replied that that was no longer an option because he had reduced my altitude to 4,000 feet, and I could not clear the ridge lines standing in the way. In addition to that, the runway was marginal at length for a B-25, and there was no emergency services. I kind of figured those might be a bit important if things went horribly wrong. So he replied saying that I could not fly into McCarran, that I would have to choose another destination. I reminded him that I had declared an emergency and that I was going to McCarran, and for some reason the controller, he was adamant that I was not going to do that. It surprised me, actually. Well, he told me to go to North Las Vegas yet again. Let's take a look at the sectional video right here. I was flying over the northern shore of Lake Mead at 4,000 feet, headed westerly towards the Old Wash, which is the VFR checkpoint for en-road going into the Class Bravo, up what is essentially a pass between the 3,800 foot peak at Boulder City and the Frenchman Sunrise mountain chain there at 4,000 feet on the right. Flying up that pass, I had just over 2,000 feet between me and the ground. A little close, but okay, I can deal with it. Continuing straight ahead, I could make a slight left turn and do a straight in for one of the 2-6 runways. There's two at McCarran, or a slight left turn for a short final for the 1-9 runways, and actually the winds favored those runways. All of this would minimize my time over the populated area of Las Vegas. So you can see my predicament. I had stepped down my altitude to comply with the controller, and by doing so, it funneled me into this pass. Once I'm down in altitude, I'm not climbing back up again. Nellis Air Force Base was behind Frenchman Sunrise Mountains. North Las Vegas was quite a bit further to the northwest, and to make it more complicated, we would have to fly further to the north in order to land to the south because of the winds and making me do a 180-degree turn. I wasn't real thrilled with that concept. McCarran really was my only choice, okay? Back to my conversation with the controller. He was still adamant that I would not land at McCarran, and again told me to go to North Las Vegas. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to land on runway 19 right at McCarran. And after several back and forth exchanges, I reiterated that I was an emergency and I was going to land at McCarran, period. And that's where I headed. I could clearly tell that the controller was mad at me and he didn't want me there. And, you know, frankly, I didn't care. By this time, the engine was barely running at idle, and the last thing I wanted to do was drive around Las Vegas and all those people and all those buildings and nowhere to land on one engine in a very heavy twin. With fuel, because we left with full fuel, and people, we were close to 26,000 pounds, maybe a little bit over. And looking out the window, I could see the geometry of my plan would work out very nicely, and I could do a shallow left turn onto final. And doing it, turning into the good engine, okay, which I wouldn't have to turn into the dead engine, and for me, that's kind of an important consideration.
If an engine cuts out on you, don't forget your minimum speed for control. Using only one engine at rated power, it's 140 miles per hour into. At less, if you apply full power to the good engine, the ship will begin to yaw. Instead, put the nose down to maintain required flying speed and adjust your rudder trim tab to balance the loss of engine thrust. The tab has ample power for this purpose. Meanwhile, feather the prop on the dead engine to prevent windmilling, and be sure to close cowl flaps so cooling is gradual. Fly with your dead engine high, and don't try any violent maneuvers. Keep a weather eye on the cylinder head temperature of your good engine, and if you need to, adjust the cowl flaps to keep within maximum permissible limits. Don't be afraid to tackle a single engine landing if it's necessary. Just keep cool and use your head. It's smart to make a high approach, reducing power all the way, rather than to start an approach from a distance and drag in over the treetops.
And GA twins, the vertical stabilizer and rudder, are barely sized to control the airplane with an engine failure. And the B-25, at least one of the rudders, it's got two, remember, is in the airstream from the running engine. But that really means that only half your rudder is effective. The other is kind of in deadish air. Unlike jets, which have enormous tails and rudders, because typically they have long moment arms for their engines, and you need a big rudder to handle all that, big vertical stabilizer. And in a jet, you just trim out the rudder to fly straight and level. It's a big difference. It's pretty awesome. It's a good thing for airliners, okay? So let me take a second here and talk about horsepower. There's been a lot of comments, I think, on the previous the 310 video about that. And I've had engine failures in jets, and I've done a huge number of practice ones in the simulator. Most jets have a thing called excess thrust, okay? And maintaining your speed and your altitude is still an issue, but it's not a marginal situation because you have more thrust than you actually need at the bottom line. An engine failure in a jet is a serious emergency, but it's not an ongoing threat to your survival, okay? In a twin, it is. In a twin GA light twin, it is a threat. Plus, full power doesn't have this thing called velocity minimum control like a propeller engine has, a propeller-driven airplane has. The VMC is a speed at which you run out of flight control authority to control the airplane with one engine inoperative and one engine at full power, okay? So that means you're slow, and it's hard to maintain altitude if you don't have power on the airplane. When the B-25 was built prior to World War II, the concept of VMC was not defined that way. They didn't even have the concept. And twin-engine airplanes had a speed they all called safe single engine speed. There wasn't a blue line either. For the B-25, the velocity safe single engine is 130 miles an hour. And as a side note, takeoff occurs around 105 knots. And if you have an engine failure below VSSE, you close both throttles and look for a place to land, period, okay? 130 is pretty fast. For a piston twin, the reality is exactly the opposite of a jet. The Wright R2600, it's a 14-cylinder radial, produces nominally 1,700 horsepower, and it has a supercharger. The trouble is that you can't use all that power. An engine at full power has an incredible stress on the machine. Lots of moving parts, heat, noise, you name it. Add to that these engines were designed to operate with a higher octane fuel than is available now. So typically nobody runs them at the max pressure, okay? Max manifold pressure. Running at full power for more than a few minutes at a time is like betting on a grenade. When's it going to explode? The outcome won't be pretty. The reality is that if you lose an engine, you have functionally lost more than half of your horsepower. You've got all the drag and only one engine to counter it, okay? If you need to climb, your rate is agonizingly slow, a couple hundred feet per minute, if you're lucky. The important thing is to not give up any altitude until you don't need it anymore, because getting it back is a hard thing to do. Okay, in the end, the controller relented. We proceeded to McCarran and we were assigned runway 19 left. I wanted 19 right, because I knew that if I stopped, I would close the runways, but I could get off 19 right and not do that. They insisted, and I figured, well, at this point, I wasn't going to argue any further. I was going to do what I was going to do. Sometime around the time we turned on final, I think right before that, we had to shut that engine down because it was no longer running well at idle. I thought it just might be possible it's going to shake itself off the mount. It was that violent. The winds were slightly crossed from the right, and I started down to the runway. And once you're configured, here's an interesting point here in B-25, once you're configured with landing gear down and some flap, you're committed to land when you go below 300-foot AGL. If you try to go around below that, you're going to hit the runway before you start to climb. When something like that happens, you know, frankly, it's hard to predict what happens next. Blow a tire, who knows? I mean, nothing really good. So below 300 feet, you're committed. You know, and I'd like to say that, hey, the landing was eventful in this emergency. I've had several emergencies where the landing was uneventful, but not for this one. At the point that I had done quite a few single engine approaches and landings in the B-25, but always with one engine at zero thrust. I lined up on the center line of the runway, and frankly, that's something that's actually hard for me to do. It takes a conscious decision. During my career flying Air Force fighters, the contract was always, you take your half of the runway, and the center line was something you don't cross until there's no conflict with the other airplane on the other side, because we always went in round in twos or fours. So for this approach on the B-25 at McCarran, once I transitioned from a crosswind crab to a wing low, I was surprised to see that the crosswind started pushing me towards the left side edge of the runway. I didn't expect that. And frankly, I didn't have anything left in the flight controls to counter that drift. I had full flight controls, everything I had, and I couldn't do it. And fortunately, I landed on the edge of the runway, the very left edge of the runway. And you know, one of the cool things about flying a B-25 is holding the nose up for this really impressive aero brake. It's awesome. But today, that emergency, and then I didn't do that. I lowered the nose so I could use the brakes to stay on the runway as soon as I could. Once under control, I headed to the right side of the runway where I could take a high-speed taxiway off the runway. That was a big lesson learned, something I didn't expect. It's like my first approach to minimums. Was a little bit sporty as well. Anyway, for real minimums. Another story. I exited the runway and I stopped, and the B-25, you know, doesn't have any nose wheel steering, so you can't taxi the airplane on one engine. Eventually we got towed back to the ramp, and you know, we survived to fly another day. I'm here telling you the story 10 years later. So what was the fallout of having the approach controller be so mad at me and adamant that I wasn't going to go to McCarran? Okay, well, frankly, there was nothing at the time. But about a week later, a little more than a week, I got an email that had passed through several different hands asking for a laundry list of items from a Las Vegas FSDO aviation safety inspector. I was at Oshkosh at the time and replied to the email as soon as I got back home, so it was actually almost 3 weeks before that happened. And I wrote a long email that outlined all aspects of the flight. I got a copy of it here, always keep copies. And there's more detail, of course, than what I've told you here. It's best to remain polite and responsive as you can be, but within the email, I made sure that I noted the relevant FAR, and I'll read it to you now, okay? Actually, I know it. So once you declare an emergency, 14 CFR 91.123, subparagraph D applies. Each pilot in command who, though not deviating from a rule of the subpart, is given priority by ATC in an emergency, shall submit a detailed report of that emergency within 48 hours to the manager of that ATC if requested by ATC. I noted in my email that no such request had been made to me or my first officer from the ATC facility that handled the emergency, definitely not within 48 hours. And because of that, I did not record any personal data from the passengers or take any statements thereof, okay? The next day, I received a reply from the ASI, the next day after I sent that email, okay? And it was a long one. But the next day, I received a reply from the ASI saying that, okay, the occurrence file is closed, so I don't need any more information, no further action required. I have no doubt that the approach controller was furious with me, and he wanted to hang me. The thing that stood in his way was the FARs and the authority afforded to the pilot in command to do what is required to recover the flight safely. This was my take. I'm sitting in the left seat. I've got 10 people on the line. My decision was to go to McCarran. The paperwork was a non-event. It was a simple email. And frankly, the least of my worries. Managing my energy, flying the airplane, running checklists, landing safely were the only things concerning me. I wasn't there to make friends. I feel for the inconvenience I caused the controller. But frankly, my problem was greater than his. Put a foot stomp on that, okay? I had 10 lives on board that airplane to consider, and flying the airplane was the most important thing, not his inconvenience. It was our lives, our airplane. I hope you enjoyed this video and you can learn something from my experience. And as it related to the 310 crash in Vegas, I think it outlines how important it is for the pilot to execute the pilot in command part. You can take input from others, you should. But it's up to you to take command as the pilot in command and execute your plan. Your plan. It's the controller's job to clear the airspace for you, period, okay? Compared to that, the paperwork is dirt simple, okay? Get on the ground, talk about it later. If you value the video, hit like, hit subscribe. It looks kind of like that right there, and you can find it right down there. Sometimes it's hard to get confused, okay? I would also like to thank my Patreon supporters. They're right up here, and I appreciate you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on FlyWire. Click this link for the latest upload. Click this link for whatever YouTube thinks you ought to watch. Or you can click this link to subscribe. Thanks for watching.